How deeply are Americans worried about AIDS? A Los Angeles Times poll found that 50% of Americans favor quarantine for AIDS victims.
Care is the right! Healthcare is the right! Act up! Fight back! Fight AIDS!
In the 1980s and 90s, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, more commonly known as AIDS, swept across the United States, taking the lives of tens of thousands of Americans. It soon became clear that AIDS, as well as the homosexual community, deserved recognition. Until that was achieved, there could not be a cure, nor would there be healthcare support and aid for a generation of young men. The ACT UP movement fought for these basic rights. HIV symptoms showed up as early as the 1950s, but in the mid to late 70s, American doctors reported a high number of strange, rare cases of pneumonia, cancer, and other illnesses among male patients who had sex with other men. Soon after, in 1982, the term acquired immunodeficiency syndrome became the stigmatic name for this disease. Though it is no longer a death sentence today, the illness is still an awful fate. In the 80s, AIDS meant death without dignity. Lesions on the skin that became large purple or brown blotches found everywhere from arms to chest to eyelids. Rapid weight loss, mouth ulcers, memory loss or neurological disorders. AIDS wore down an immune system so much that the symptoms were what killed those infected, and the only available drug at the time, AZT, was extremely difficult to attain, and it caused its own horrific side effects. AZT itself was toxic for many people. It was far from a cure for the plague that was taking 8 Americans per minute. And what was the government doing during all of this? Nothing. Audio record from a White House press briefing in 1982 reveals the appalling attitude of the Reagan administration towards the AIDS epidemic. The reporter Lester Kinsolving aims questions at Press Secretary Larry Speakes. President Ronald Reagan never publicly acknowledged the disease until 1987. By this time, 41,027 Americans had already died from the disease, and 71,176 Americans were diagnosed with AIDS. This did not matter to Reagan. Like many other conservative Americans, the disease was almost seemed to be deserved as a punishment for homosexuality. In Reagan's words, "Don't medicine and morality teach the same lessons?" His view reflected the beliefs of mainstream America. Though efforts for LGBT rights in the past had made some impact, it was not until the AIDS epidemic that a hugely powerful impact in mainstream culture and politics truly began to occur. In many ways, the ACT UP movement, also known as the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, had to fight just to be acknowledged. They took the unique urgency created by the plague and used it to fuel a campaign that would change America socially, politically, and scientifically. The movement officially began in March of 1987. The story goes that Larry Kramer, a longtime activist and speaker, aimed a question to a group of people attending a demonstration. Do we want to start a new organization devoted to political action? The response was positive. A couple days later, over 300 people met to form ACT UP New York. In the following years, the movement spread across the country, most notably in New York City and San Francisco. They popularized powerful phrases and slogans such as "Turn fear into rage," "Silence equals death," and of course, ACT UP, Fight Back, Fight AIDS. Whether protesting pharmaceutical corporations on Wall Street or the homophobia and anti-contraceptive teachings of a church, deep-seated anger and fear accompanied the campaigns. I think the hardest part was that no matter how hard you worked, it didn't make a difference in keeping people alive, because that was beyond human capacity at the time. That quote was from Garance Frank-Ruta, a female activist who focused her energy on promoting the testing and marketing of drugs for the infections that resulted of contracting AIDS. This man took a different route, one more focused on the social aspect of the movement. His name is David Robinson.
AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. We are a diverse, nonpartisan group of individuals united in anger and committed to direct action to end the AIDS crisis.
He is one of 128 surviving members of ACT UP New York. He was part of the coalition from 1987 to 1994 in both New York and San Francisco. He sat down to chat with us about his experiences.
I was lucky enough to get involved in ACT UP from the first demonstration, not the first meeting, but after their very first meeting in New York, they immediately planned a demonstration, and I was it would have been 1987. I had graduated from college in 1986. And in New York, I was I was a dancer by day and a waiter and bartender by night, and I was looking for a gay liberation group. And I'm not finding one. And I happened to see a poster announcing this massive demonstration on Wall Street. So I went and ended up quickly getting very involved. So I was very services. The government wasn't providing services. So the initial response was, a kind of compassionate care. But once those systems were established, then it was, well, what can we, why aren't there treatments? Oh, wait a second, why isn't the government even, talking about the, et cetera? So, the scale of death was so enormous. When my partner was 10 years older than I was, so I was in my 20s, he was in his mid-30s, and by the time we got together, he was 33. All but like 2 of his friends were dead, and it was like that was the sort of, if you were in that age range and part of a large enough gay community, you could be going to, it wasn't an exaggeration, some people were going to funerals every week or every other week. So yeah, that made it, the sense of urgency was so immediate. But they put us on the bus and they had us all seated on the bus while they continued to do whatever they were doing. And someone managed to get, I think, out of his cuffs and got out a lipstick and put on lipstick and then passed it along, and we all made up very beautifully so that when the cops came back in, they suddenly, and we're all still sitting there like we're arrested. They sort of didn't quite know what to do. The campiness of some of the rests was a lot of fun.
As the disease wore on, ACT UP's efforts pushed it further into the spotlight. More and more people came out of the closet during the 80s and 90s, especially those who had been diagnosed. Some devoted all the time they had left into the ACT UP movement, even if that meant losing support of family and friends. Some fought for the sake of their family and friends. Either way, the movement's growth was representative of the shift toward gay rights becoming human rights. With the AIDS-induced death of beloved public figures such as Rock Hudson and Freddie Mercury, mainstream acceptance of gay rights seemed even more attainable. In November of 1991, the day before he died, Mercury announced his diagnosis, saying, "The time has now come for my friends and fans around the world to know the truth, and I hope everyone will join with me, my doctors, and all those worldwide in the fight against this terrible disease." The ACT UP movement moved perceptions of homosexuality from a marginalized position into the mainstream attention of society. Since ACT UP, laws have been passed to allow homosexual people to serve in the military, to get married, and have ended discrimination on an economic scale. These tangible changes in the social perception and rights of the queer community are due to movements like ACT UP, which began the normalization of homosexuality.